I'm going to show you 6 different ways to winterize Musa Basjoo and other banana plants. These techniques will allow you to grow ornamental and even some varieties of fruiting bananas in colder climates down to zone 6 with minimal effort. Now, I live near Seattle, Washington, and have successfully overwintered a variety of banana plants, including Musa Basjoos, dwarf Cavendish, blue Javas, manzanos, and other varieties. I'll be talking quite a bit about Musa Basjoos, but know that these techniques can work with any type of banana plant. There's no one right way, but depending on your conditions, some of these methods are going to be more effective than others. In the end, do some trial and error and figure out what works best in your area with the resources that you have available. Now, before we get into the 6 methods, I do want to cover just a little bit about the anatomy of a banana plant. When we talk about overwintering, there's really one thing that matters, and that is the corm of the plant. The corm is a solid mass that sits just below the soil, and that's really the powerhouse or energy store of the plant. And when we talk about overwintering, the goal is to keep the corm alive. If that's all you do, you will be able to grow banana plants. Keep that corm alive. While some of these techniques work to protect the stem, ultimately you do not need to keep the stem alive in order to keep the plant alive. Bananas can die back to the ground, and as long as the corm is alive, push out new plants and grow just fine come springtime. So let's get into it. The first method is to actually do nothing. Now, this only works if you're in a warmer climate, something like zone 8, particularly 8B. If you're in a warmer climate, talking about Musa Basjoos in particular, you don't need to do anything. Now, I would always recommend a good layer of mulch to help protect the roots. You can also cut down some of your leaves and throw those on the ground to provide some extra protection. But ultimately, I go through the winter with some of my bananas and I don't do anything to them. I just let them be. It's very easy to do that. It creates no kind of plastic or other material waste because you're not using anything. And the bananas, as long as the ground doesn't freeze where you're at, you don't have to do anything to keep Musa Basjoos alive from one season to the next. The second technique, very similar, cut them down to whatever size makes sense for you. It doesn't matter whether you cut it down to the ground or cut it a foot tall or 3 feet tall, a meter tall, 2 meters, however, whatever makes sense for you. And really it's about aesthetic during the winter. You're going to have to look at these things, unless you cut them all the way to the ground, which you can do, leaving height on it and help you get taller plants in the spring. But ultimately, trimming them up is a good way to reduce the ugliness during the winter. And again, the stem itself doesn't matter if it's exposed to the elements. You're not going to kill the plant if the stem is exposed of the Musa Basjoo banana during the winter. The third technique, dig them out and put them in a pot for the winter. This is what I do for some of the more sensitive types of bananas like manzanos. I even do this with my blue Javas and have done this with dwarf Cavendish as well. You can plant them in the ground for the spring and summer. They'll grow very well. And then when winter comes, dig them out of the ground and throw them in a pot and stick them inside. To do that, I start 6 to 12 inches out from the base of the stem of the plant, dig around it in a circle. And once you have that circle, push the shovel all the way in, all the way down, and start to lever out that banana plant. Now you're going to hear popping and some tearing as the roots disengage from the main part of the corm, but rest assured it's okay and the plant will be just fine when you put it in a pot. I would suggest you get the biggest pot that you can handle. Think about, you've got to move this thing indoors, and how are you going to do that? Pots get really heavy once you put soil in them, and you've got a plant in there. I actually use a dolly myself so that I can deal with bigger pots and don't have to try and carry them or push them from their location outside to the inside. But go with the biggest pots you're able to handle. One thing you can do to handle some bigger pots, and I do this also because of the amount of rain that we get where I'm at, I put about 50% perlite into my soil mix. So I use basic potting soil from the local hardware store and mix that with about 50% perlite. The perlite helps with draining. It also makes the pots a lot lighter, so it's easier to move them around. Now, the benefit that you get is that the plants will continue to grow indoors, not quite the same speed as they do in the summer, but they will continue to grow over the winter. The downside to this technique is you need a fair amount of floor space, as well as you need some height. Mature banana plants can get very tall depending on the variety. Musa Basjoos can grow even in cold climates up to 20 feet tall. And so you're going to need some space if you're going to pot up a bunch of banana plants and bring them inside for the winter. The fourth technique that you can use is to store them dormant in a cold, dark room. Now, when you first hear this, this might not make sense to you, but you can actually hibernate banana plants. They will go to sleep. They won't need any light or any water, and they can survive like that over winter in a cool place, and they will be just fine in the spring. You can wake them back up and they will continue to grow again. So if you're going to use this technique, start by trimming the plant. Don't do what I did here and just dig it out. It's easier to trim when it's in the ground. Cut it down to a manageable height. I usually put it at about 1 to 2 feet of stem. Again, you don't need any stem, but I'd find having a little bit of stem makes it easier to handle. Trim it down, dig it out just the same way as if you were going to pot it. 6 to 12 inches around the base of the stem. Dig a circle, lever the plant out. Once you have it out of the ground, hang it upside down for a week or two. And I do that by just leaning it up against the house, let it drain water out. That will help reduce the chance of any fungus developing while it's stored over the winter. After about a week or so, go ahead and stick it in its final spot. You can wrap it in something if you want to. I actually put them in black bags just so they get zero light and they go to sleep. And in the springtime, you can pull these back out, plant them back in the ground, and they will start growing again just fine. You can leave more stem if you want to. That will help the plants be taller sooner when you plant them back in the spring, but it is not required. Another technique you can use to overwinter the bananas is to wrap them. There are a number of materials you can use to do this. It's common to use bubble wrap, horticulture fleece, burlap, anything that's going to provide some additional warmth. This technique is really about protecting the stem over the winter. And what that's going to do is give you taller plants starting in the spring. Now for my plants, I can't tell the difference by the middle of summer, which ones I wrapped and which ones I didn't. The ones that don't get wrapped do catch up. So again, this isn't required to keep the plants alive, but it does give you taller plants earlier in the year. So depending on what matters to you, it might be worth doing this if you want that taller look sooner. To wrap banana plants, what you want to do is cut off all the leaves, cut them as close to the stem as you can, and then get your wrapping material out. There's not one exact way that this works best, but the way that I do it, I use bubble wrap, and I get a piece that starts at the ground, goes up over the top of the plant, and goes all the way back down to the ground. Once that piece is in place, I start wrapping it from the top around the stem, just folding it over and spiraling it down using duct tape to hold the bubble wrap in place. You want to make sure that you don't leave a gap at the bottom of the stem exposed. And so once you have the bubble wrap in place, you want to check and make sure that that gap isn't there. If you do have a gap, it's fine. The best way I've found to deal with that is to pile up some leaves. You can even use the banana leaves that you cut down. Pile up some leaves around the base of the stem. That's going to provide it with some extra coverage and some extra warmth, and make sure that it doesn't freeze down there at the bottom. Now, again, this is not required to keep the plant alive. It's just going to give you taller plants in the springtime. The last method is known as the cage method. There are a few variations of this, and you don't even necessarily need to use a cage. There are different ways that you can do it. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is build up additional protection above the soil so that the corm is protected from any freeze. This is particularly useful if you are in a colder environment where the ground freezes more than an inch or two, and can allow you to protect the plants in a way that you can leave them in the ground over winter. You don't need to dig them up or put them anywhere else, but it does require some work. Now, before you actually build a cage, the first thing you want to do is figure out how tall you need to make that cage. What you want to think about is how deep does the ground freeze where you are at and where your bananas are at? Where is the frost line? If you don't know that information, you can call either a local plumber or your water utility company. They should be able to tell you, because they install water lines under the frost level. Any good plumber or the utility company should be able to tell you where the frost line is in a particular area. With that knowledge, you now know how tall of a cage you should build. It also lets you know how far out from the base of the plants you should build your cage. I would typically take the frost line and add 50% just to make sure that it's going to be enough and that you don't miss it by a couple of inches. It'd be terrible to do all this work and realize that your cage was an inch too short and the corm froze and your plant's dead. But once you know where your frost line is, add 50% to that. That's how high and how wide from the base of the plant you want to build your cage. So once you know the height that you need to get in order to move the frost line up so the corm doesn't freeze, now you want to go through, first trim the bananas down so they'll be slightly under the height of the cage once it's completed. So if your frost line is a foot underground, you're going to build a cage that's 18 inches tall. I would cut the banana down to about 15 inches or so. On the meter side of things, say your frost line is 50 centimeters down, I would plan on building the cage 75 centimeters tall, and I would cut the banana stems down to around 65 centimeters or so. Once you've got the plants trimmed down, you can build the cage. The cage can be made out of just about anything. It doesn't even have to be metal. I'm using a metal outdoor pin for my dog, the chief inspector. You can build it out of chicken wire if you wanted to do that. You could use a plastic pin, one that's for kids, anything that's going to hold material to the height that you need to hold it. It's okay too if your cage is taller than it needs to be, which is the case here because I'm using something I already had. Cage is quite a bit taller. That's okay if you're repurposing something that you already have. Another common way to build these is with hay bales. So instead of using metal, you can do it with hay bales. That also means you need less leaf material for the inside of your cage. You can actually use the thickness of the hay bales to offset what you would need to put in. Ultimately, you want to build that container up. And once you have that in place, fill the inside with plant material. You can use leaves from around your yard. You can use the leaves from the bananas. You can use cut pieces of stem from the bananas as well. If you're using hay bales, you could actually cut the banana down to the ground and just put hay bales on top of it and not use any leaves at all. If you preferred to do it that way, that would work just fine. Once you have that in place, consider putting a tarp over the top of it, especially if you have a lot of leaves and you live in a windy winter environment. You want those leaves to stay in place and don't want them blowing away. Secure a tarp over the top of it if you feel like that's appropriate for your environment. Now, building a cage takes a lot more work than some of these other methods, but it is going to give you the protection where it matters, which is on the corm, and it will allow you to overwinter in the ground Musa Basjoo and other types of banana plants that will survive your environment. Now, the cage method takes more work than the other methods, but it is a way that you can overwinter Musa Basjoo and other bananas in the ground, keep them alive, and have them come back in the spring. Now, what's right for you is going to depend on your goals and the types of bananas that you're growing and the environment that you're in. But all of these methods will provide you the techniques to grow Musa Basjoo and other banana varieties in environments where they wouldn't typically grow. Click on this next video to watch me dissect a Musa Basjoo banana plant. You can see all the different parts inside, get a really good look at the corm and all of the other parts of the banana plant.